It happened in seconds. 6 interruptions. 1 boiling room. But it was the 7th moment that left America speechless. The hearing chamber, already tense, seemed to shrink under the weight of 2 clashing forces. The seasoned senator whose interruptions had become his weapon, and the rising congresswoman who carried both dignity and restraint like armor. Ted Cruz leaned forward, finger raised, his voice sharp and unyielding. He cut across Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence. Not once, not twice, but again and again. Each time, her words were sliced short, her patience tested, the rhythm of her testimony shattered. The audience watching live felt the sting. Viewers at home shifted uneasily, some shaking their heads, others gripping their phones ready to tweet. This wasn't debate. It was domination disguised as dialogue. Yet Crockett didn't crumble. With every interruption, she chose stillness, her eyes steady, her expression composed. She let him speak over her as though storing each offense in silence. It wasn't weakness. It was calculation. The room didn't know it yet, but every pause, every measured breath, was a fuse slowly burning toward detonation. The 6th interruption came like all the others, sudden, loud, and dismissive. Cruz pressed harder, his tone dripping with entitlement. His words meant to erase hers. But if he thought control was his, he was wrong. What he didn't see was that the stage was shifting. What he didn't feel was the tide turning beneath his very feet. Because silence can be louder than arrogance. And restraint, when finally broken, can hit with the force of an earthquake. Crockett's composure wasn't surrender. It was preparation. The kind that waits for the exact moment when the weight of truth will land hardest. And so, as millions leaned forward in disbelief, one question gripped the air. How long could she endure before the response came? 6 times she was cut off. 6 times she allowed it. But the 7th interruption, the 7th would not be forgotten. The chamber was about to witness something it had never seen before. America was about to hear a voice rise not in anger, but in undeniable authority. And when it came, Ted Cruz would finally learn that interruption has a limit, and beyond that limit, silence turns to fire. But what happened next left the entire country in disbelief. The hearing was supposed to be routine. Another day in Washington where elected officials spar over policy and posture for cameras. On the surface, it was about oversight, about accountability, about asking questions that demanded answers. But beneath the surface, something more raw was unfolding. In that chamber, the debate wasn't simply over documents or procedures. It was over who holds a microphone and who gets to keep it. Ted Cruz walked into the room with the confidence of someone who believed the spotlight was his by default. He was seasoned, calculating, and knew that his interruptions would not be challenged by those who had grown accustomed to his domineering style. To Cruz, interruption was not rudeness. It was strategy. It was his way of reminding everyone in the room that his voice, his presence, carried more weight than anyone else's. And where his opponent was a younger black congresswoman, his instinct to dominate seemed only more emboldened. This was not the first time America had seen such dynamics play out. Across boardrooms, classrooms, courtrooms, the story repeats. When women, when people of color, when those from immigrant-rooted communities try to speak, they're often drowned out by louder, more entitled voices. The hearing became a stage for that universal struggle. And millions watching felt the sting not just for Jasmine Crockett, but for themselves, for every time they had been interrupted, dismissed, or silenced. Crockett, however, did not meet force with force. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't surrender either. Instead, she leaned into silence, allowing Cruz to talk over her again and again. To some, it may have seemed like she was yielding ground. But to those watching closely, her restraint was its own form of resistance. It was as though she was saying, I will not let you drag me into the mud. I will not let you dictate the rhythm of my words. The tension thickened with each interruption. Viewers at home felt their own frustration mount, wanted her to snap back, to reclaim the mic. Yet Crockett's calm was deliberate. With each pause, she built suspense. With each interruption endured, she sharpened the contrast between arrogance and dignity. Cruz looked restless, animated, even frantic, while Crockett grew only more steady, more composed, as though she was waiting for a precise moment when silence would no longer suffice. The cultural stakes could not have been clearer. This was not a battle of policy. It was a battle over voice. Who gets to tell America's story? Who gets to decide which words are heard and which are swallowed? For progressives, for immigrants, for anyone who had ever felt dismissed, Crockett's quiet defiance became a mirror. The hearing was no longer just political theater. It was a parable of power, and power, as the chamber was about to learn, does not always roar. Sometimes it waits, still and patient, until the arrogance of interruption has piled so high it collapses under its own weight. As Cruz leaned in yet again, hands slicing the air, voice cracking with insistence, Crockett simply blinked, letting him run out of breath. 6 times she had been cut off. 6 times she chose not to unleash her response. But America was watching. Social media timelines lit up with disbelief. Commentators whispered, and viewers leaned forward as though sensing the coming turn. Because with every interruption, the country began to lean closer to their screens. To understand what happened in that hearing room, you have to understand the man who walked into it already believing he owned the floor. Ted Cruz is not new to this stage. He has cultivated a reputation that stretches far beyond Texas, a Harvard-educated lawyer, a U.S. senator with a gift for sharp-tongued retorts, and a man who thrives on confrontation. To his supporters, he is a fighter. To his critics, he is an opportunist whose arrogance eclipses any sense of humility. From the very beginning of his political career, Cruz carved out an identity built on being the loudest voice in the room. He learned that by bulldozing, by interrupting, by never yielding an inch, he could dominate the narrative. It wasn't just debate strategy. It was theater. He relished the performance of power. In his mind, control meant speaking more, louder, faster, and never letting his opponent breathe. There's a reason so many of his moments have gone viral. Not because he brings people together, but because he thrives on division. Flashback to his Senate hearings. Cruz wagging his finger at witnesses, mocking their expertise, using sarcasm like a dagger. Flash to his public spats on cable news, where he interrupts journalists mid-question, seizing their words to twist them into fuel for his own agenda. Flash even further back, to his days as Solicitor General of Texas, where his courtroom arguments carried not just logic, but an edge of disdain for those who dared to challenge him. And who could forget the infamous spectacles? The government shut down in 2013, when Cruz grandstand a marathon speech that turned into a performance more about spotlight than substance, or his fiery exchanges during the 2016 presidential primaries, when he sneered at rivals, his smirk signaling that he relished not just winning, but humiliating. Again and again, he has displayed the same pattern. Speak over, dominate, mock, control. To Cruz, interruption is not a breach of civility. It is a form of conquest. Each cut-in is a trophy, proof that he can bend a moment to his will. He believes that silencing an opponent mid-sentence shows strength, that commanding the microphone demonstrates superiority. But what he fails to grasp is that constant interruption reveals something else. Insecurity, a fear that if others are allowed to finish, his argument will not stand on its own. It is this addiction to control that defines him. Cruz is a man who measures his victories not by what he builds, but by what he breaks down. He is less architect than demolitionist, tearing through his opponent's words before they can take form. And it is this very trait, this relentless hunger for dominance, that set the stage for his undoing. Because arrogance has a way of blinding those who wield it. In the chamber, he believed Jasmine Crockett would fold under pressure, that his interruptions would scatter her thoughts and strip her of authority. He mistook her silence for weakness, her composure for hesitation. He saw her pauses as space for him to expand his ego, never realizing that each pause was a rope quietly tightening around his performance. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, Cruz, animated, restless, fueled by the need to hear his own voice echo across the room. On the other side, Crockett, calm, steady, embodying the kind of poise that only come from knowing who you are and who you represent. And that is the lesson he was blind to see, that interruption is not dominance. Dominance, as he was about to learn, is not the same as power. True power is not in cutting someone off. It is in allowing the silence to stretch long enough that when the words finally come, They cannot be ignored. In that hearing, Cruz walked in convinced that control was his default position. He believed the cameras would capture his command, that America would remember his interruptions as authority. But what America saw instead was a man expose his insecurity with every outburst, and a woman who, through restraint, made the stage hers without even speaking. Cruz's backstory is one of arrogance mistaken for brilliance, of interruptions mistaken for intellect. And it was this very pattern, the addiction control, the thirst for spotlight, the obsession with belittlement, that made the 7th moment so unforgettable. Because arrogance always sets the stage for its own collapse. And when it collapsed, it was Jasmine Crockett who stood steady, ready to transform silence into something far more powerful than interruption could ever be. What Cruz didn't know then, but America soon would, is that the story of the 7th interruption wasn't his story at all. It was hers. Before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in the halls of Congress, she was already forged in the crucible of struggle. Raised in St. Louis, she understood from an early age that the rules were not written equally for everyone. She saw how communities like hers were often ignored until election season, how promises were made with fanfare only to evaporate when the cameras turned away. Those experiences didn't break her. They built her. Crockett chose the law not as a career of prestige, but as a tool of defense. In Dallas, where she planted her roots, she became known not for courting big clients or chasing headlines, but for taking on the cases others overlooked. When young men of color were charged disproportionately, she stood beside them. When families faced eviction, she fought to keep them in their homes. And when protests erupted over injustice, she didn't just march. She offered her legal services to those who had been arrested for daring to raise their voices. She wasn't building wealth. She was building credibility, trust, and a reputation for standing exactly where the fire was hottest. Her courtroom presence was different from the grandstanding theatrics of politicians like Cruz. She didn't shout to be heard. She chose her words with surgical precision, cutting through arguments with logic and a sharp edge of wit. Colleagues quickly learned that silence from Crockett wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. By the time she spoke, her opponents were often already unraveling. That same composure carried into her political life. When she ran for state office, she did so on a platform of service, not self-promotion. And when she later ascended to Congress, she carried her community stories with her. The single mother working double shifts, the teenager fighting to stay in school, the immigrant family navigating a system that seemed stacked against them. Crockett was never just speaking for herself. Every time she opened her mouth on a House floor, she carried a chorus of unheard voices behind her. And yet, with that weight on her shoulders, she carried herself with grace. Unlike Cruz, who sought cameras, Crockett did not chase viral moments for their own sake. But when those moments found her, she owned them. Time after time, when confronted with arrogance or hostility, she turned the tables with a line so sharp it cut across the internet within minutes. Her retorts were not reckless jabs. They were carefully timed scalpel strikes, exposing hypocrisy and commanding respect. Those who underestimated her often regretted it. A colleague might expect her to shrink from confrontation, only to discover that her refusal to back down was matched by a lawyer's instinct for precision. When someone tried to shout her down, she would let them finish, then deliver a response that pierced through the noise like glass shattering on marble. This reputation was not built overnight. It was born of years of learning to listen, to wait, to measure before striking. Crockett intelligence did not demand constant applause. It demanded impact. She understood something many in Washington never learned, that power doesn't always belong to the loudest voice. Sometimes it belongs to the voice that speaks last, the one that lands with such clarity it reverberates long after the room has gone quiet. It's this quality that made her such a stark foil to Cruz. He relied on volume and dominance. She relied on patience and precision. He brandished his interruptions like weapons. She wielded silence like a shield until the perfect moment to unsheath her blade. The more he sought to belittle her, the more he revealed his insecurity. And the more she held her ground, the more she revealed her strength. For her supporters, Jasmine Crockett became more than a congresswoman. She became a symbol of resistance against being silenced. She embodied the countless people who've been talked over in classrooms, in boardrooms, in their own homes, yet refused to give up their voice. Every time Cruz cut her off, it wasn't just Crockett he was interrupting. It was the millions who saw themselves in her silence. This is what made that hearing room more than a stage for political sparring. It was a mirror for America's larger struggle. Who gets heard, who gets erased, and who refuses to vanish. Crockett's story, her roots, her rise, her relentless defense of the voiceless, set the stage for what came next. Because silence, for her, was never surrender. It was strategy. She had been underestimated before. She had been dismissed, interrupted, talked over. And every time, she had waited, collected herself, and delivered the kind of words that people remembered. So as Ted Cruz leaned into his seventh interruption, finger pointed, voice dripping with arrogance, Crockett was not rattled. She was ready with a line that would not just counter him in that room, but ripple out far beyond its walls. This is why, on the seventh interruption, Crockett was ready with a line that would echo far beyond that. The clash did not erupt all at once. It built like a storm, each wave louder than the last, until the room itself felt charged with static. Ted Cruz began to exchange with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed the rhythm. Speak sharply. Cut in quickly. Never let your opponent breathe. Jasmine Crockett answered calmly, but before she could complete her first point, his voice sliced through hers, forcing her words into fragments. She stopped mid-thought, her lips pressed together, her eyes steady. For a moment, it looked as if she might push back immediately, but she didn't. She let the interruption land, let it hang in the air. The silence on her part only magnified the arrogance on his. Cruz leaned back in his chair, satisfied, and launched into his own talking point. The second interruption came even faster. Crockett began again, this time attempting to weave her argument into the record. Cruz leaned forward, voice booming, tone dripping with dismissal. Once more, her words dissolved beneath his. A ripple of discomfort spread through the chamber. Staffers shifted in their seats. Glances darted across the room, as though wondering how long this could continue. By the third time, frustration was palpable. Crockett held her composure, pausing deliberately, her silence almost daring him to keep going. And he did. Cruz seemed to grow bolder with each cutoff, convinced that talking louder equaled talking stronger. The effect was theatrical, but not in the way he imagined. Cameras captured the imbalance. One man charging relentlessly, one woman standing calm against the tide. On the fourth interruption, Crockett tilted her head slightly, the faintest flicker of disbelief crossing her face. It wasn't annoyance, it was recognition. She had seen this pattern before, in courtrooms, in debates, in every space where women of color were expected to yield ground. The moment was no longer about her testimony. It was about whether she would be allowed to speak at all. Viewers at home felt it too. Twitter timelines lit up with exasperation. Let her talk, one user posted. This is unbearable, another wrote. Memes began forming in real time, some mocking Cruz's interruptions, others celebrating Crockett's unshaken demeanor. The digital crowd outside the chamber became its own chorus, amplifying what those inside already sensed, that this was bigger than politics. It was about respect. By the fifth interruption, murmurs broke out in the audience behind the senators. A cough here, a shift of posture there, small signs of irritation that the performance had gone too far. Cruz, however, seemed oblivious. He mistook the unease for silence, silence for consent. He believed he was winning, when in reality, every word he stole only deepened the public's disdain. Crockett, meanwhile, grew only more composed. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't raise her voice. She simply paused, again and again, each pause like the drawing back of a bowstring. She understood something Cruz did not, that the longer he monopolized the air, the more powerful her eventual words would become. Every interruption was fuel, feeding not his dominance, but her impending strike. And so the tension climbed minute by minute. 6 times he broke in. 6 times he stole the floor. 6 times he refused to break her calm. The chamber buzzed with unease. The online world surged with outrage. And the clash was no longer just 2 politicians sparring. It was a parable unfolding before millions of eyes. And then came the 6th, the one that set the stage for history. The seventh interruption came like all the others, loud, abrupt, and dripping with entitlement. Ted Cruz leaned in, eyes narrowed, his fingers slicing the air as if to punctuate his authority. His voice rose, cutting across Jasmine Crockett's mid-sentence cadence with the smug certainty of a man who performed this act countless times before. He believed he had mastered the rhythm, seize the floor, steal the sound, and drown out any opposition until the chamber echoed only with his words. But this time, the atmosphere was different. You could feel it shift like the final breath before a storm breaks. Crockett did not react instantly. Instead, she paused. Not the pause of surrender, but of calculation. She let the silence grow heavy, her eyes fixed firmly on him, her chest rising and falling in deliberate rhythm. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to either lash out or retreat. But Crockett didn't either. She let the interruption finish, let Cruz's words stumble into a hollow echo, and then in the calmest, most deliberate tone, she delivered a line so surgical it cut deeper than any raised voice could. "Senator," she said evenly, her words carrying across the chamber with chilling precision, "if interruption made a man right, you'd be the wisest among us. But it doesn't. It only shows who's afraid to listen." The silence that followed was not empty. It was electric. It was the sound of the air itself being rewired. Cruz blinked, just once, but enough to register that something had landed squarely where he least expected it. His mouth twitched, searching for a retort, but for the first time in exchange, nothing came. He shifted in his chair, his confidence visibly cracking, his practiced rhythm broken. The chamber reacted instantly. A few muffled gasps echoed, followed by stifled chuckles that spread like sparks across dry grass. Staffers glanced at one another, eyebrows raised. Members sitting nearby leaned back, a flicker of satisfaction washing over their faces, as if they had witnessed a long-awaited moment of justice. And outside the chamber, in living rooms and on phone screens across America, viewers erupted. Twitter feeds flooded with GIFs, captions, and instant hashtags. Memes sprouted in seconds. Cruz froze in mid-blink. Crockett's words etched like a closing argument. It felt less like a congressional hearing, and more like a courtroom climax. The kind you see in films with a lawyer, underestimated all along, finally unleashes a question or the line that dismantles the opposition's entire case. The hero doesn't need to shout. They don't need to rant. They simply pierce the theater with truth, and the jury, the audience, feels the weight immediately. Crockett's line was exactly that, and Cruz knew it. He tried to recompose himself, clearing his throat, shifting papers, forcing a smirk as if to brush it off. But the hesitation betrayed him. His eyes flickered toward the cameras, then away, as though he realized the clip was already immortalized in digital amber. His dominance, carefully staged over 6 interruptions, had just collapsed in a single sentence. Meanwhile, Crockett sat unshaken. She did not grin. She did not gloat. She simply leaned back slightly, her calm demeanor underscoring the gravity of what she had just done. It was restrained as triumph, proof that she didn't need theatrics to dismantle arrogance. She needed only the truth, delivered at the right moment, in the right way. The murmurs in the chamber grew louder. One could hear the shuffle of chairs, the low hum of astonishment. For those in the room, it was clear. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. Cruz, once the domineering presence, now looked smaller, almost deflated. Crockett, once the target of relentless interruptions, now held the room without raising her voice. The audience at home could feel it too. Clips of the exchange were clipped, captioned, and circulated with lightning speed. She ended him. One tweet declared, "That's how you handle arrogance." Another read, hashtags like hashtag Crockett Clapback and hashtag 7th Interruption trended within minutes. The internet wasn't just watching, it was celebrating. In that instant, the hearing became more than a political confrontation. It became a cultural moment, a piece of living theater that symbolized something far greater than two politicians sparring. It represented every classroom where a student was talked over, every workplace where someone's voice was dismissed, every kitchen table where stories were silenced. Crockett's words were not just a rebuttal to Cruz. They were a vindication for millions who had felt the sting of being unheard. And that is what made it devastating. Cruz hadn't just lost control of the room. He had lost control of the story. What he intended as dominance had been revealed as insecurity. What he wielded as power had been exposed as fragility. And Crockett's line, simple, poised, unforgettable, became the mic drop that shattered his performance. The cinematic beat was undeniable. You could almost hear the imaginary soundtrack swell. The camera zooming on Cruz's faltering expression, then panned to Crockett's steady gaze. It was the kind of moment that doesn't just live in news cycles. It embeds itself into political folklore. But Crockett wasn't finished. Her silence after the line was just as intentional as the words themselves. She didn't clutter the moment with more talking. She let the weight of her statement linger, knowing that the pause afterward would echo even louder. Cruz shifted again, clearly eager to move on, desperate to regain footing. But everyone watching understood. The exchange was over. He had been silenced, not by volume, but by dignity. And yet, while the chamber processed what just happened, the world outside was already reacting in real time. On TikTok, creators clipped the moment into 15-second reels, adding captions and applause tracks. On Instagram, influencers reshared the clip with messages about respect, voice, and justice. On YouTube, compilations of Cruz's interruptions ended with Crockett's line. Framed like the climax of the film, it was not just Crockett's victory. It was a cultural touchstone, proof that the quiet power of truth, delivered with precision, could dismantle even the most practiced arrogance. But the battle wasn't over. Outside the chamber, the real shock waves were just beginning. The clip didn't just circulate, it detonated. Within minutes of the exchange, Twitter was ablaze with commentary. The hashtag 7th Interruption trended nationally, climbing past celebrity gossip and sports highlights. Side by side, gifs of Cruz's blinking hesitation and Crockett's poised delivery filled timelines. Someone slowed the video down, set it to dramatic music, and captioned it, "And this is how you end arrogance." Thousands shared it before the hour was over. Instagram reels lit up with remixes. Some layered Crockett's line over boxing knockouts, others over courtroom dramas. One edit paired her words with a mic drop sound effect and a freeze frame of Cruz's stunned expression. TikTok creators pounced, lip-syncing her words with perfect timing, turning a congressional hearing into a cultural anthem. And then came the commentary. On cable news, anchors leaned forward with restrained grins as they replayed the clip on loop. Analysts called it the moment the hearing turned into history. Progressive commentators praised Crockett's composure, calling it an example of strength without shouting. Even centrist pundits admitted the power dynamic flipped in seconds. Late-night hosts couldn't resist. One joked, Cruz tried to filibuster Crockett, but she filibustered his ego instead. The studio audience roared. Another compared it to a courtroom drama finale, where the underdog delivers a line that changes everything. Celebrities joined in, too. An award-winning actress reposted the clip with the caption, "Teaching a masterclass in dignity." A famous rapper stitched Crockett's words into a beat, rapping, "Interrupt if you want, but you can't silence the truth." Influencers across platforms hailed it as a moment of cultural justice, the kind of exchange that reminded people why representation matters. But the reactions weren't just entertainment. They were deeply personal. For women, for people of color, for anyone who had been talked over in meetings or dismissed in conversations, Crockett's calm, cutting line was validation. Comment sections filled with stories. "This is exactly what I wanted to say to my boss." Reminds me of every time I was ignored in class. She didn't just clap back. She stood up for all of us. Meanwhile, Cruz became the punchline. Memes mocked his blinking pause, his failed attempt to regain composure. Some labeled him the Senator of Silence. Others wrote faux motivational posters, his finger raised mid-interruption, the caption reading, "When you think talking over someone is a strategy, until it isn't." The shift in perception was undeniable. Crockett, once framed by critics as too sharp or too bold, now shown as dignified, deliberate, powerful. Her silence carried more weight than Cruz's interruptions ever could. And Cruz, who built a persona on control and dominance, was suddenly cast as the man who lost a battle he thought he had already won. The moment transcended politics. It wasn't about Democrats versus Republicans anymore. It was about identity and respect, about who gets to be heard in America. Crockett's victory resonated because it wasn't performed. It was lived. She didn't just win an argument. She embodied a truth millions recognized instantly. That dignity, wielded at the right time, dismantles arrogance more completely than anger ever could. In the days that followed, Crockett's office was flooded with messages of support. Donations surged, small dollar contributions pouring in from people who had never heard her name before, but now saw her as a symbol of resistance and pride. Cruz, meanwhile, dodged questions from reporters, brushing off the moment as internet noise. But the damage was already done. The narrative had escaped his control, and no dismissive quip could reel it back. By the end of the week, the clip had amassed millions of views across platforms. Commentators called it a defining cultural snapshot of the year, a reminder that power isn't measured by who talks the loudest, but by who hold their ground. And as the dust settled, one truth was clear. Crockett had given America more than a viral moment. She had given it a symbol. Proof that even in the noisiest rooms, dignity can silence arrogance. But the question remained. Would this spark simply fade as another internet trend, or would it ripple outward into something bigger, reshaping debates, inspiring resistance, and redefining what it means to be heard? The room had witnessed more than a clash of words. It had witnessed the triumph of quiet power. Crockett's moment was not merely about a hearing, nor was it simply about a senator's arrogance meeting its match. It was about something far deeper, the enduring struggle over whose voices are heard and whose are silenced in America. When Ted Cruz interrupted again and again, it wasn't just procedural sparring. It was a performance of entitlement. The old belief that volume could substitute for truth, that interruptions could erase perspectives deemed inconvenient. But Crockett reframed the entire encounter. She didn't treat the interruptions as personal attacks. She treated them as symbols of a system that too often drowns out the voices of women, of immigrants, of communities of color, of anyone who refuses to conform to the old order. Her silence in those moments carried a weight louder than shouting ever could. Each pause reminded the room and the nation that arrogance is brittle, while dignity endures. By the time her final words landed, it was no longer just Cruz on trial. It was the very idea that noise equals power. And in that instant, America saw it shattered. The moral is universal, timeless. Respect outlasts arrogance. Truth pierces through noise. Dignity dismantles ego. Crockett's composure was not weakness. It was strategy, conviction, strength in its purest form. She revealed that true authority is not in interruption, but in persistence, not in domination, but in clarity. For millions watching, the lesson resonated beyond politics. Teachers who've been talked over by louder colleagues, workers whose ideas have been stolen mid-meeting, students dismissed before they could finish a thought. Crockett's moment gave them a mirror, showing that the quiet insistence on being heard can shift the balance of power more profoundly than bluster ever could. And that's why the clip kept spreading, not just as entertainment, but as inspiration. People saw themselves in Crockett's composure, in her refusal to bow, in her ability to turn patience into a weapon sharper than any insult. The chamber became a stage, but the story belonged to all who had ever waited for their turn to speak, only to be told, implicitly or explicitly, that their turn would never come. Her mic drop moment was not just a takedown of Cruz. It was a declaration that dignity is not negotiable, that respect is not optional, that the future belongs to those who hold their ground with courage. And so, as the dust settled, one truth remained suspended in the air like a verdict. Arrogance is fleeting, but dignity leaves echoes. Crockett had not only silenced her opponent, she had reminded America of what power truly is. Because in the end, the hearing was never just about two lawmakers. It was about the oldest struggle in democracy itself. Who gets to speak and who gets to be heard? And in that chamber, on that day, the answer rang clear. But the story wasn't finished, because dignity, once unleashed, does not stay confined to a single room. It ripples outward into homes, into movements, into the way we measure justice itself. The question now is whether America would carry that lesson forward or let the noise rise again. Ted Cruz interrupted Jasmine Crockett 6 times, but it was the 7th that shut him down. What began as arrogance ended as silence. And in that silence, a truth spoke louder than any raised voice ever could. Because sometimes the loudest voice isn't the one that wins. It's the one that refuses to be silenced. Crockett's moment reminded America that dignity is not weakness. It is strength. That respect is not given freely. It is demanded through presence, through clarity, through calm power. This wasn't just a clash in a committee room. It was a glimpse into the future of America's debates, into who we allowed to define the conversation. And it was a reminder that arrogance can dominate for a moment, but dignity endures long after the cameras stop rolling. If you felt that truth resonate, if you saw in Crockett's words a reflection of your own struggles to be heard, then this story belongs to you too. Join the conversation. Share this moment with others. Be part of the community that lifts up respect over ridicule, truth over noise, and dignity over ego. Because history isn't only written by the powerful. It's written by those who refuse to be interrupted. And when we stand together, when we amplify voices that embody dignity, we create more than a viral clip. We create a movement. So subscribe, stay connected, and add your voice to this community. Share this video, tell your story, and remind the world. Interruption may steal seconds, but dignity shapes history.